welcome the anointed ones. Nothing embarrasses the ego more than the truth arriving without permission. There's a moment that almost nobody prepares for, the exact second when someone who built their identity on appearance, control, reputation, or superiority suddenly realizes the spotlight they enjoyed has quietly turned into a microscope. And here's the uncomfortable fact. Psychologists have long observed that when a person's self-image is threatened publicly, the brain reacts almost the same way it does to physical danger. That's how serious ego exposure feels internally. It's not just awkward, it's survival-level uncomfortable. Because ego doesn't mind being wrong in private. Ego only panics when witnesses show up. What makes this situation even more intense is that exposure rarely happens loudly at first. It begins with small details not adding up. A timeline that doesn't match, a story that shifts slightly, a confidence level that suddenly drops from untouchable legend to let me explain energy in record time. And once people notice that shift, the room changes, respect changes, even silence starts sounding different. The truth is, ego can survive criticism. Ego can survive rumors. Ego can even survive failure. But ego struggles to survive clarity. And when clarity arrives, it doesn't knock politely. It walks in, pulls up a chair, and turns the lights on brighter than anyone expected. So, what you're about to see isn't just embarrassment. It's what happens when an identity built for performance meets reality that refuses to cooperate. And that moment, that's where the real story begins. Number 1. Their confidence was never confidence. It was control disguised as certainty. For years they walked through rooms with a certain air, with heads turning and people nodding as if their presence alone demanded respect. It looked like confidence. It sounded like confidence. Everyone assumed it was confidence. But it wasn't. What they were really doing was controlling perception. Every word they spoke, every gesture, every pause was calculated to shape how others saw them. They weren't standing on truth or skill. They were standing on the illusion of mastery. And illusions are fragile. Confidence, real confidence, doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need verification. Real confidence feels solid whether anyone is watching or not because it comes from knowing yourself and your abilities. What they had was different. Their so-called confidence depended entirely on attention, approval, and the absence of scrutiny. If nobody was watching closely, it worked. If nobody challenged them, it worked. But the second someone looked closer, asked the right question, or saw a crack in the facade, the whole structure started shaking. That's why exposure is so brutal. It doesn't just reveal mistakes, it exposes the core lie that their ego was built on. People see it crumble, and the person experiencing it realizes they have nothing to stand on but a carefully curated image. The certainty they carried so proudly, the confidence that made others believe in them, was never theirs. It was borrowed from the reactions, fears, and assumptions of everyone around them. And that is a kind of humiliation that hits deeper than any insult, because it forces them to face the truth. Everything they projected as strength was actually a shield for insecurity, and all the admiration they enjoyed was temporary, conditional, and easily stripped away. Real confidence would have survived scrutiny. Real confidence wouldn't need the spotlight to feel whole, but theirs was control masquerading as certainty, and when control is gone, certainty evaporates. Exposure doesn't just humble them. It reveals that what everyone admired was never authentic. It was an act, and acting is exhausting. The moment the audience sees it, shame arrives, uninvited, relentless, and impossible to ignore. Number 2, they didn't fear being wrong. They feared being seen clearly. Most people think the worst part of being exposed is being wrong, But that's not true for someone whose ego runs on performance. Being wrong can be fixed. Mistakes can be explained, apologized for, or even forgotten over time. What terrifies them is being seen clearly, stripped of the carefully built layers they relied on to feel untouchable. Exposure doesn't just reveal a misstep, it exposes the difference between the person they presented to the world and the person they actually are. That gap is where shame lives, and it hits harder than any public critique ever could. They spent years crafting a version of themselves that seemed untouchable. Every story, every claim, every little boast was a piece of armor designed to control how others perceived them. They thought they could walk through life without anyone looking too closely, assuming no one would notice the inconsistencies, the exaggerations, the half-truths. But when exposure arrives, all of that carefully constructed armor shatters instantly. The world sees them not as a confident, capable individual, but as someone trying to appear confident and capable. And that realization is corrosive. It eats away at the ego from the inside because it proves that their identity was never grounded in reality. It was grounded in perception. Shame isn't loud. It's the quiet, crushing knowledge that the self you've relied on isn't real. It's seeing the people who once nodded and smiled start to hesitate, question, and look differently at you. And the worst part is that this isn't about other people's judgment. It's about the internal reckoning. They can't hide from it because they always knew, deep down, that the version of themselves they projected was an act. Exposure just lifts the curtain and forces them to face the truth they were already avoiding. What makes this type of shame so intense is that it's irreversible. Being wrong can be corrected. Being misunderstood can be clarified. But once people see you clearly, fully, without the protective layers you built, there's no going back. The ego screams in panic because the safety net of perception has been ripped away, leaving only the raw, undeniable reality. The person everyone admired was never the person they thought they were, and facing that truth is devastating. Number 3, their authority worked only. While no one asked questions, authority built on silence is always temporary. They walked into rooms with people nodding, agreeing, and deferring, and they believed that was power. They believed that as long as nobody challenged them, their position was secure, their influence unshakable, and their ego untouchable. But the truth is, authority isn't about how many people look at you. It's about how you stand when someone actually looks closely. Their so-called authority was a performance, a stage act maintained by the absence of scrutiny. The moment someone dared to ask a question, to challenge a claim, or to notice a flaw, the foundation they thought was unbreakable began to crumble. For them, the silence of others wasn't peace or respect. It was a mask of compliance. They mistook quiet observation for agreement and nodding heads for loyalty. That's why exposure feels catastrophic. It doesn't just reveal one mistake or one inconsistency. It reveals that the entire structure of their authority was built on a fragile illusion. The more they relied on people not questioning them, the more vulnerable they became to even the smallest disruption. And when exposure arrives, that disruption is relentless, unstoppable, and completely public. Authority that depends on fear, appearances, or avoidance of questions can survive for a time, but it collapses instantly under inspection. People start connecting dots, noticing contradictions, and questioning motives. Those who once deferred now hesitate, and hesitation spreads like a contagion. What they thought was respect turns out to have been temporary compliance, and suddenly, the ego that thrived on admiration faces its own reflection, hollow, performative, and utterly exposed. The harshest truth is that real authority doesn't need silence to exist. True authority stands strong even when challenged, even when questioned, even when the room is full of skeptics. Exposure doesn't invent shame. It reveals that what they called power was never real. It was borrowed energy, dependent on everyone else's inattention, agreement, and fear. And once that borrowed energy is gone, the person is left naked in front of the world, facing the devastating realization that their influence, their control, and their sense of superiority were never theirs to begin with. That is the kind of truth that doesn't just embarrass, it shatters. Number 4, they built their image faster than they built their character. They spent years crafting a persona that looked impressive, polished, and untouchable. Every outfit, every post, every carefully chosen word was a brushstroke in a picture designed to make others believe in their greatness. People admired them, respected them, and often envied them. From the outside, it looked like they had it all together, like their life and their identity were solid and unshakable. But image grows fast, character grows slowly, and the problem is that you can only maintain an image for so long before reality begins testing the foundation beneath it. Character is invisible until pressure arrives. It's the quiet strength, the consistent honesty, the ability to own mistakes without panic, and the patience to grow over time. Image, on the other hand, is loud, flashy, and immediate. It can make someone look strong without actually being strong. They relied on the rapid construction of their image because it gave instant results, attention, admiration, influence. But when exposure comes, it doesn't examine what looks good or what seems impressive. Exposure measures what is real. And when people finally notice the difference between the image and the underlying truth, the fall is swift and merciless. They didn't just overestimate the power of perception, they underestimated the permanence of truth. The things they carefully displayed, the version of themselves that commanded respect, was only ever skin deep. All it took was a small crack, a question nobody expected, or a single person connecting the dots for years of curated appearance to collapse. And when it does, the realization hits harder than embarrassment. It's the awareness that their so-called identity was borrowed from admiration, not earned from integrity. The shame isn't just in being exposed, it's in realizing that the effort they put into appearing impressive never built a foundation strong enough to support who they truly are. People can be fooled for a long time, but character has a way of catching up. And once it does, image becomes meaningless. When that gap between appearance and reality finally shows, the person is left confronting the truth. They have invested in the wrong thing, and no amount of charm, stories, or performances can fix it. Exposure doesn't just humble them, it unveils the emptiness they hid behind for so long. Number 5. They thought being impressive was the same as being respected. They spent years collecting admiration like trophies, believing that looking powerful, speaking confidently, and impressing people was the same as earning respect. They built an arsenal of achievements, status symbols, and social proof, parading them to the world as if they were invincible. To the outside observer, it looked like they had it all together. People nodded, smiled, and sometimes even flattered them. But the problem is that admiration is temporary, conditional, and surface level. Respect is earned, tested, and enduring. And exposure doesn't care about appearances. It tests the core. Being impressive is easy in controlled environments. You can prepare your words, rehearse your moves, and show the version of yourself that works best in front of others. People clap, they nod, and you feel validated. But respect isn't won by a single performance. It's built over time, through consistency, integrity, and the ability to handle challenges without crumbling. Exposure has a way of separating these two things, the impressive and the respected, Because it strips away control and shows who you are when the spotlight isn't flattering and the applause isn't guaranteed. What hits hardest in these moments is the realization that people admired a mask, not the person beneath it. Every compliment, every nod, every smile that once felt like affirmation suddenly feels like a mirror reflecting your own misjudgment. They thought they had built authority, influence, and value, but all they had built was perception. And when exposure arrives, perception disappears, leaving only reality. The shame doesn't just sting, it cuts deep because it forces them to confront the difference between admiration and respect, and between being liked for appearances and being trusted for substance. They learn that being impressive is a performance anyone can applaud. Being respected is something earned quietly, patiently, and relentlessly. Exposure doesn't just humiliate them publicly. It exposes the painful truth that all the effort, charm, and cleverness they relied on was never enough to earn what truly matters. The ego trembles because it realizes it spent a lifetime chasing applause while missing the foundation that could have held it steady. Number 6. Their ego was built around being needed, not being honest. For a long time, they thrived on the idea that people couldn't function without them. Their identity depended on being essential, indispensable, the person everyone needed to solve problems, make decisions, or hold things together. It didn't matter if they were honest, genuine, or skilled. What mattered was that others relied on the illusion of their importance. That dependency became the cornerstone of their ego. They felt untouchable because they believed that being needed was the same as being respected or admired. But exposure doesn't wait for permission. It comes in quietly, in ways that unravel the story they've been telling themselves for years. Suddenly, the people they thought depended on them realize they were perfectly capable on their own. The emergencies that once elevated their presence vanish. The praises that once reinforced their importance evaporate. And in that instant, the ego built on indispensability faces a brutal reality. Being needed isn't the same as being valuable, and being relied on isn't the same as being honest or worthy. What makes this type of shame so devastating is that it's not just external, it's internal. They begin to feel the hollow echo of a life spent convincing themselves and others that their role was critical. The moments when they were needed were never about their actual contributions, but about the perception of their influence. Exposure doesn't just strip them of status, it strips them of the narrative they've clung to, revealing the emptiness that supported their sense of self. The irony is sharp and relentless. Honesty could have built something lasting, something immune to the scrutiny of time and truth. But they chose the shortcut, being necessary over being genuine. And now, the moment of exposure forces them to confront the truth they ignored. People don't need someone who performs importance. They need someone who is authentic. The ego shatters because it discovers that all the dependence, admiration, and recognition it leaned on was conditional and fragile. The shame isn't just public humiliation. It's the piercing realization that they invested in the wrong foundation, and the real measure of worth can never be borrowed from anyone else. Number 7. They didn't expect evidence to exist. Their ego thrived on assumptions. They believed the world wouldn't look too closely, that people wouldn't notice the small inconsistencies, the tiny exaggerations, the contradictions they left scattered in conversations, messages, and actions. They acted as if no one was paying attention, as if their story would be accepted at face value, simply because they said it with confidence. That's the dangerous comfort of ego built on perception. It assumes the absence of evidence is the same as approval. But exposure doesn't work that way. Evidence exists, and when it surfaces, it doesn't negotiate. They didn't prepare for the reality that people notice patterns, remember details, and connect dots over time. Every lie, every boast, every carefully constructed facade leaves traces, and traces accumulate. Even the quietest observers collect them without judgment, silently piecing together a puzzle the ego thought impossible to solve. And then one day, those pieces align. The discrepancies no longer hide in plain sight. They form a picture that cannot be denied. The ego, which relied on assumptions, suddenly finds itself confronting undeniable truth. What makes this especially humiliating is that exposure isn't manufactured, it's discovered. The shame isn't about someone accusing them, it's about someone proving that the story they relied on as a shield doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Evidence doesn't care about confidence, charm, or fearlessness. Evidence simply exists, and the moment it is recognized, the person who assumed invisibility or ignorance experiences a collapse of control. The harsh irony is unavoidable. For so long, they believed reality could be negotiated through presentation, persuasion, or intimidation. But evidence is relentless. It accumulates, it endures, and it exposes. The deeper humiliation comes from the realization that their ego depended on people not noticing, not on being right, not on being honest, and certainly not on being capable. Exposure strips all of that away, leaving them to confront the fact that the world they assumed was pliable has been documenting their truth all along. And once that truth is revealed, the ego doesn't just shrink, it shatters. Number 8. They confused being untouched with being untouchable. For years, they moved through life believing they were invincible. Nothing ever seemed to touch them. No criticism stuck, no mistakes lingered, no consequences appeared to land. They interpreted this as proof of untouchability, the kind of quiet supremacy that makes an ego feel permanent. They strutted through rooms, made decisions without hesitation, and assumed their position was unassailable. But being untouched is not the same as being untouchable. Untouchable is earned. Untouched is often just lucky timing, oversight, or the patience of others. The moment exposure arrives, that illusion collapses instantly. Suddenly, all the protection they assumed was permanent disappears. The problems they ignored or manipulated catch up. The inconsistencies they left unchecked are highlighted. The people who stayed silent out of fear or strategy begin to speak, revealing patterns they assumed no one noticed. The shield of being untouched was never armor. It was an illusion, a temporary mirage, and the ego built on it has no real defense when reality finally shows up. What makes this realization especially humiliating is how slow it creeps in before it hits like a tidal wave. They notice a pause in conversations where once there was deference, a hesitation in trust that wasn't there before. The small cracks appear at first almost imperceptibly, until the full picture becomes undeniable. The world that seemed to orbit around them, bending to their will, suddenly looks indifferent, or worse, aware. And the ego, which thrived on the assumption of untouchability, cannot reconcile the difference between the narrative it built and the truth being revealed. This is the cruel lesson exposure teaches. Being untouched is temporary. Being untouchable is earned through substance, integrity, and resilience. They spent their life believing the former was enough, and now they are forced to confront how fragile that fantasy was. The shame is relentless because it doesn't just embarrass. They realize they mistook absence of consequence for invincibility, and the moment the truth lands, there is no way to regain the safety they never truly had. Their ego, once inflated by perceived invulnerability, crashes under the weight of reality. Number 9. They thought silence around them meant agreement. For years they walked through rooms assuming that the quiet nods, the blank stares, and the absence of challenge were signs of agreement. They mistook observation for consent, hesitation for admiration, and patience for loyalty. Every unspoken moment reinforced their ego, making them believe that people were on their side, that their ideas were untouchable, and that their authority was unquestioned. They built their confidence on the assumption that silence equals approval, and that assumption became a dangerous crutch. Exposure shatters that illusion, because silence rarely means what the ego thinks it means. People are quiet for countless reasons: fear, strategy, timing, or simply waiting to see if truth will catch up. Quiet doesn't always mean support, it often means calculation. And when someone finally breaks the silence, pointing out inconsistencies, revealing contradictions, or exposing lies, the ego realizes it was relying on a mirage. The admiration and compliance they assumed were real were, in fact, temporary and conditional, dependent entirely on their ability to maintain control. The humiliation lies not just in being contradicted, but in realizing how long they misread signals. Every silent nod that once inflated their sense of self suddenly feels like a lie. Every unchallenged moment, a trap they walked into thinking it was safety. They discover that people were paying attention all along, quietly collecting evidence, remembering details, and connecting dots that the ego assumed didn't exist. And once the pattern emerges, once exposure surfaces, the ego cannot defend itself because it was built on misinterpretation, not reality. What makes this type of shame so intense is that it is intimate, almost personal. It's not just about others seeing the cracks, it's about finally seeing them yourself. They were blind to the fact that their own assumptions were fragile, that silence is not a guarantee, and that people are more aware than they let on. Exposure forces them to confront the truth. The world is not a reflection of their ego, and silence has been patiently waiting for the moment to speak. The fall is inevitable, and the ego, once comfortable in assumed agreement, collapses under the weight of reality. Number 10. Their reputation was borrowed, not owned. For years they moved through life as if their reputation was an unshakable asset, a shield that protected them from scrutiny and criticism. People admired them, titles elevated them, connections supported them, and associations made them appear untouchable. They believed that this borrowed credibility, these external validations, were the same as having earned respect or trust. Every compliment, every introduction, every nod from someone influential reinforced the illusion that they were solid, dependable, and admirable. But exposure doesn't care about borrowed status. It strips it away and reveals what, if anything, actually belongs to you. The harsh truth is that a reputation built on association is fragile. It relies on the people, circumstances, and perceptions that exist outside your control. One small discrepancy, one witness who remembers differently, or one revelation can erase the carefully constructed narrative. And when that happens, the ego suddenly discovers how thin the veneer really was. The admiration that once seemed permanent was conditional, temporary, and external. It wasn't a reflection of who they truly are. It was a reflection of how others chose to perceive them. Exposure doesn't create shame. It uncovers the gap between borrowed identity and actual character. What makes this especially painful is the internal reckoning it forces. They may have believed they had earned influence, respect, and authority, but exposure proves that none of it was fully theirs. People see beyond the borrowed accolades and notice inconsistencies, gaps, and falsehoods. The network of borrowed credibility crumbles, leaving the person to face themselves without the safety net they relied on for so long. The ego, once confident in its untouchability, now trembles because it discovers it never owned what it thought it did. Titles, Connections and associations can give the illusion of permanence, but they can't replace authenticity. When exposure arrives, the borrowed reputation falls apart, and the person realizes that their life was being propped up by perception rather than substance. That realization doesn't just embarrass, it hits deeper, shaking the foundation of self-worth built on borrowed power. The shame that follows is relentless because it forces them to confront the truth. They've been admired for the wrong reasons, and until they earn respect from reality itself, nothing they once relied on can save them. Number 11. They thought the audience would never compare stories. They believed their narrative was untouchable, carefully curated and delivered just right, so that no one could question it. Every statement, every explanation, every story they told was designed to control perception, to shape reality in their favor. They assumed people would take what they said at face value, that nobody would notice contradictions, and that different perspectives wouldn't collide. That was their fatal mistake. People remember details, notice patterns, and compare stories, even when they seem unrelated or insignificant. Exposure comes not from a single slip. It comes when multiple truths finally align and reveal the cracks the ego never anticipated. They relied on compartmentalization, thinking that if one story worked here and another worked there, nobody would ever connect the dots. But humans are pattern-seeking creatures. Conversations overlap, timelines intersect, and inconsistencies become impossible to ignore. Exposure is relentless because it doesn't need to invent evidence. It waits for people to talk, to recall, to remember. What they assumed would remain isolated is suddenly connected, forming a web of truths that demolishes the carefully constructed version of themselves they presented to the world. The humiliation is deeper than just being caught in a lie. It's the realization that their entire sense of control was an illusion. They thought they were untouchable because no one could challenge a single story in isolation. They never considered that the world, in its quiet way, was always comparing, analyzing, and remembering. And the moment someone pieces it together, the ego faces a collapse far more devastating than any single confrontation could ever deliver. What makes this exposure brutal is that it's cumulative. Every small discrepancy that seemed insignificant becomes a thread, and when enough threads connect, the entire fabric of their ego unravels. People suddenly see the contradictions, and the person sees them too. The audience they assumed was passive becomes the judge, and the carefully curated image of control and superiority disappears. Their arrogance, their assumption that stories exist in isolation, becomes the very thing that triggers public shame, and the collapse of their self-image is both inevitable and unavoidable. Number 12. They were performing strength instead of developing it. For years, they carried themselves like they were unbreakable, like pressure and scrutiny would bend around them rather than touch them. People believed it, and so did they. Every confident word, every bold action, every display of composure was carefully performed to convince the world, and themselves, that they were strong. But there's a critical difference between performing strength and actually having it. Performance relies on appearances, timing and control, while real strength survives scrutiny, adversity, and unexpected challenges. When exposure arrives, the performance crumbles because it was never built to withstand reality. It was only built to impress it. They thrived on the applause, on the nods, on the recognition that comes from appearing capable. That applause reinforced the illusion that they were strong, but it never tested the foundation beneath. Performance strength can look flawless in the right conditions, but real strength shows up in chaos, when control is stripped away, when no one is watching, and when the consequences are immediate. Exposure doesn't wait for rehearsals. It comes uninvited, unplanned, and unforgiving. The person performing strength suddenly finds themselves unable to navigate the pressure they once seemed to manage effortlessly. Their ego, once inflated by appearance, collapses under the reality it was never built to endure. The shock of exposure is particularly harsh because it reveals the difference between perception and substance. People realize they were only observing a skillful act, not an actual capacity to handle difficulty. And the person experiencing it feels the weight of every moment they relied on performance over preparation, image over integrity, and impression over authenticity. It's humiliating because the strength they thought defined them was never theirs. It was borrowed from the assumptions of others, from the reactions of an audience, and from circumstances that were always favorable until they weren't. In the end, exposure doesn't just reveal weakness, it exposes the ego's dependence on illusion. They learn, often painfully, that real strength cannot be faked, cannot be borrowed, and cannot survive solely on performance. When the spotlight shifts from admiration to scrutiny, performance fades, leaving only the raw truth. Their strength was an act, and the world has finally seen the difference. Number 13. They didn't expect the quietest person in the room to notice everything. They always underestimated the quiet ones. The people who sat back, observed, and never raised their voice were dismissed as unimportant, irrelevant, or too passive to matter. They believed influence belonged to the loudest, the boldest, the most visible. Their ego thrived on attention, on reactions, on people responding exactly as expected. They assumed the quiet people weren't paying attention, that they weren't noticing inconsistencies, contradictions, or gaps in the story. That assumption became a ticking time bomb, waiting for the right moment to explode. The quiet observer notices everything. They see the small gestures, the subtle lies, the micro-expressions that reveal more than words ever could. They remember details that the ego thinks have been forgotten. They connect the dots that the performer assumed were isolated. And when exposure comes from someone who was assumed invisible, it hits harder than anything else because it's unexpected. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, it's precise, undeniable, and impossible to dismiss. The person whose ego thrived on visibility realizes too late that the one they ignored has been quietly documenting every misstep, every exaggeration, and every facade. What makes this revelation brutal is that it exposes both arrogance and vulnerability simultaneously. The ego assumed control because it believed it understood the dynamics of the room. It assumed it could predict who mattered and who didn't. But the quiet observer doesn't play by those rules. Their attention is patient, consistent, and often underestimated. When they speak, when they reveal what they've noticed, it's not just proof of scrutiny, it's proof that the ego has been blind to reality the entire time. The collapse that follows is swift and total. The person realizes that all the performance, all the confidence, all the manipulation of perception was observed and analyzed by someone they thought didn't matter. The shame is sharp because it's not just about being exposed, it's about being exposed by someone they never thought capable of seeing through them. The quietest person in the room becomes the catalyst for truth, and the ego, which believed it controlled the narrative, is left powerless, raw, and completely exposed. Number 14. The shame isn't about the exposure, it's about losing the version of themselves they believed was permanent. The cruelest part of being exposed isn't the public embarrassment, the criticism, or the judgment. It's the collapse of identity. The sudden realization that the person they believed themselves to be was never real. For years, they built a version of themselves that felt untouchable, admired, and superior. Every word, action, and display reinforced that identity. They convinced themselves that it was permanent, that it was theirs to keep regardless of circumstances or scrutiny. Exposure doesn't just challenge that illusion, it obliterates it. When the facade falls, the ego doesn't just feel vulnerable, it feels irrelevant. The confidence they relied on, the admiration they assumed was eternal, and the respect they thought was guaranteed are suddenly gone. What remains is a raw, undeniable truth. The version of themselves they trusted, the one they performed every day, was never grounded in substance. They begin to realize that their identity was borrowed from perception, from reactions, from the assumptions of others. And when that borrowed identity is stripped away, shame doesn't just arrive, it floods every corner of their awareness. The intensity of this shame comes from its permanence. Public exposure is temporary, but the internal reckoning is ongoing. They must live with the knowledge that their carefully constructed self-image has been dismantled, that admiration was conditional, and that the world sees them differently than they saw themselves. It's a moment that changes the way they view every past action, every choice, and every interaction. They recognize that they invested in appearances over authenticity, in performance over integrity, and in borrowed approval over earned respect. And this realization cuts deeper than any external judgment because it is intimate, unavoidable, and entirely internal. Exposure didn't invent shame, it revealed it, amplified it, and made it undeniable. The loss isn't just of reputation, it's the loss of the self they believed was permanent. That version of themselves, the one they clung to and defended, evaporates, leaving only the unvarnished reality. And in that void, the ego faces the harshest truth of all. Identity built on illusion cannot survive exposure, and the shame that follows is the echo of what they never truly had. The story of an ego exposed is never just about embarrassment. It's a deep, unsettling revelation that shakes the foundation of who someone thought they were. Every point we've explored reveals the same undeniable truth. When identity is built on perception, control, borrowed power, or performance rather than substance, it cannot withstand scrutiny. Confidence becomes a mask, authority becomes fragile, admiration is mistaken for respect, and influence that relied on silence or fear collapses the moment clarity arrives. The quiet observer, the accumulated evidence, the contradictions in stories, all of it patiently waits for the moment when the illusion can no longer hide. What we see in someone whose ego has been exposed is not just shame. It's the collision between fantasy and reality. It's the painful awakening that the version of themselves they believed to be permanent was never real. Every carefully constructed image, every moment of assumed invincibility, every display of strength or indispensability, once stripped away, leaves them confronting a truth they were never ready for. Exposure doesn't just reveal mistakes, it reveals character, or the absence of it, and forces a reckoning that is as intimate as it is public. The fall is not just social, it is internal, relentless, and unforgettable. And yet, there is a lesson hidden within this collapse. The very things that expose someone, truth, attention, scrutiny, honesty, are also the tools to rebuild. Real strength, real respect, and real authority do not rely on perception. They survive in clarity. The difference between shame and growth lies in what comes after. Exposure strips the false, but it also creates space for authenticity, resilience, and a version of self that no one can take away. So, take a moment to reflect on this. Whether you've witnessed it in others or felt it yourself, understand that exposure is the ultimate truth-teller. It cannot be avoided, and it cannot be ignored. And if you want to keep learning about the power of perception, ego, and human behavior, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, leave your thoughts in the comments, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Every share spreads awareness, every comment sparks discussion, and every subscription ensures you're ready for the truths most people are too afraid to face. God bless you.